So alright, the first part of this demo is to create a MySQL database instance. As I said, I'll be using Cloud SQL of Google Cloud Platform. If you want, you can use RDS also, or you can host your MySQL database server on your local machine or on your data center as well. But as we have things readily available by cloud service providers, I'm going ahead and creating a MySQL instance on GCP. So I'll not show you all the steps. What I have done here is that I have created a MySQL instance or MySQL database instance, and I provided public IP and private IP both. The only thing that I wanted to show you is these IP addresses. This is the public IP address and this is the private IP address. Now, if you notice that the private IP address is different than our network address, which you have been using so far. But we'll be using this private IP address to connect to this MySQL database instance. First of all, let's try to connect to the database instance without a service, without any external service for that matter. So I'll use this private IP address and I'll use MySQL client to connect to this database. Now I'm in this master node and I have MySQL installed already in this Debian server. So let me go ahead and connect to this database. So if you see, I am connected to the database. There should not be any databases as such currently, except for the system databases, information underscore schema, MySQL, performance underscore schema, and sys. These are all system databases. Let us go ahead and create a database for ourselves just for the sake of creating. Let's say KTSDB. It should work now. Show databases should show me this KTSDB. All right, perfect. So it is done. Now the thing is that I'm using the IP address, and let us go ahead and use a service. So this is the service. API version is v1, kind is of course service, and the name of the service is KTS external service. Labels are not necessary, but still I have mentioned some labels. And the type actually can be either node port or cluster IP. So if you remove type by itself, it will create a cluster IP service. Now in the target port, we are mentioning the target port number, which is the port of the external database. So the MySQL database that I have shown you, and I use this command to connect to this MySQL database. If you can see, this is running on port number 3306. I'm mentioning the same 3306 in target port also. And then port is the service port. Typically it should be same, but if you want you can change it also. Let me change it to 8080 or let's say 9000, and protocol is TCP. Now this is the service and I'll go ahead and create this service. So I'll create this in the same prod namespace, and the service should have been created. And this is the new one, KTS external service of type cluster IP, and this is the cluster IP 1097.140.191. Now the thing is that you have just created the service, and if you see the manifest file, the service has not been linked with the database yet. So how do you do that? For that we'll have to create the endpoint. This is the new object that we're creating. It is of kind endpoint. API version is v1. Metadata is the name of the endpoint, and notice that the name of endpoint is similar to the name of the service. You have to make sure that this works, otherwise the linking between the service and the endpoint will not happen. But instead of specification, we have subsets here. Now in subsets we have addresses and ports. Addresses is the IP address of the external database server. So in our case, we have already seen that the IP address of the external database server is 1079.48.3, and that's what we are mentioning here. And port is of course the port where the database is running, which is 3306. Now let me go ahead and create the endpoint. Should have been created in prod namespace, so there you go. And we should have a lot of objects here. We have this external service, and we have this deployment, but you cannot see the endpoints here. You have to do kubectl get endpoints along with the namespace, of course, to get the endpoint. So endpoints, so here is the endpoint, which is K8s external service that we have just created. The endpoint is pointing to the external database server with this IP address and this port. Now, if you have to connect to the database, we have to use the cluster IP address, or we can use the service name also from our application. So I'll not show you the service name, and this is the advantage of using services, because so far we have not used service name as such, because we are yet to discuss something called Kubernetes DNS or kube DNS. After that, I'll show you how we can use the service names. But this is one of the advantages. Now we don't have to use the IP address anymore. We can use the name of the service. But for the sake of demo, let's use the IP address to connect to the database. Now here I'm using a different host number, which is the IP address of the service. I'm not using the host or the IP address given to us by Cloud SQL. Port should be same, users should be same, and now I should be able to connect to this database. Sorry, my bad, I cannot use port 3306. It has to be 9000 because that's what we have done the mapping with. And now if you see, I am connected to the MySQL database. It's a very common mistake that you use the same port number, but here, as you are using the cluster IP address provided by the service, the port number should also be that of the service rather than the actual database port. So that's why I say typically you keep it similar. Like I should have kept it 3306, but just to prove my point, I have changed the port number. This database server should be the same as I had shown you earlier. So if I type show databases, I have this K8s database, and I can go ahead and create databases, tables, etc., etc. That is not the purpose of creating databases, tables, and schemas, but this is what I wanted to show. Now, one thing is that I have used the node to connect the external database using a service. This is not the use case. This is not how it should be done. So you should have your application inside of pods. So the application should use this service that we have created, and the name of the service should suffice, which is mapped to this cluster IP and to this port. Now whenever you use either the service name and the port or the cluster IP and the port, it will go and hit the endpoint, which is K8s external service, whose name is same as that of the service itself, and then it will go and actually hit the external database sitting with this IP address on this port. So that's how it should work, and you should never ever create a service just to connect from the node itself. You can do it using the IP address as well, but the purpose of creating the service is to use the service name to connect to the database rather than the IP address. Now, why do you do that? Just a last minute thing. So let me go to the endpoint. Let me show you the endpoint address. Now, if you see, the name of the endpoint is same and the name of the service is also same. Now, suppose for some reason the IP address of the database server changes. So if that happens, and that can happen because the database server is external to your cluster and may be external to your control also, and maybe there's some changes that have happened because of which the IP address got changed. If you do not use a service, you'll have to change the IP address in your application program and have to pass the parameter and start the application again using pods and deployments and services. But if you use an external service, the only thing that you have to do is delete the old endpoint, edit this endpoint file, change the IP address here with the new IP address, and then create the endpoint again. Do not have to do anything whatsoever in your application, and your application will run as is. So that is one of the biggest advantages of using services. Is it used a lot? Yes, not a lot, but some. So that's what external service does, and that's how external services work in Kubernetes.